Good afternoon. I'm Robert Dijkgraaf, the Director and Leon Levy Professor at the Institute of Advanced Study, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here to this Institute faculty lecture. Our speaker today is Didier Fassin, the James D. Wolfensohn Professor in the School of Social Science. And Didier was appointed here in that position, first holder actually of that chair, in 2009. And his brief CV and actually his academic life, and you will see also this talk is actually quite interdisciplinary, because Didier basically is both an anthropologist, a sociologist, and a physician. He actually was trained as a medical doctor at the Université Pierre-Marie Curie in Paris. He practiced internal medicine and taught public health before turning to the social sciences. In fact, he obtained a doctorate in medicine in 1982, a master in public health in 1986, before he earned his PhD in 1988 at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, where he still serves as a director of studies. He has also been a professor at the Université Paris-Nord. Didier has dedicated his early research to medical anthropology, and among other things, he has examined the AIDS epidemic, inequalities in health, and changes taking place in global health in various parts of the world. More recently, he has developed political and moral anthropology, and he has conducted field studies in many parts of the world, including Senegal, Ecuador, South Africa, and France. As part of the French national research body CNRS, he created and directed an Institute for Interdisciplinary Research on Social Issues, IRIS, and he served in many other leadership roles at the juncture of science, of health, and society. Among others, serving as an administrator and vice president of Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders. He's a member of the Scientific Council of the City of Paris, many other distinctions. Among others, he's a Chevalier de Palme Académique, appointed in 2007. Didier is the author and editor of many books on topics including moral anthropology, humanitarian intervention, the concept of victimhood, and as I said, the AIDS epidemic in South Africa. His current anthropological undertaking, for which he received an advance grant of the European Research Council, is towards a critical moral anthropology. And we have had some beautiful programs here at the Institute about this. He recently published the first ethnography of police patrols in France, based on 15 months he spent with the police in the outskirts of Paris, because Didier is also a person that really does very intense and practical field work. His current work includes the description of the justice system, prisons and asylum, and again, spending a lot of time in these very difficult circumstances. Today's lecture is, as you can see, the arduous path of refugees in the changing landscape of asylum. I think that topic is particularly dear to the Institute, that, as you know, has a long history of providing a haven for scholars at risk. In fact, in some sense, the Institute was in the 1930s, I would say, an intellectual Ellis Island for political and Jewish refugees from across Europe. As always, at the end of the lecture, there will be time for questions. And then after the lecture, I'll invite all of you for a reception in the common room at Fould Hall, where we can continue our conversation. Now, please join me in welcoming Didier Fassin.
On December 17, 1994, a 19-year-old woman from Togo landed at Newark International Airport. She told the border officer that she requested asylum, but was immediately placed in detention by the Immigration and Naturalization Service. She then spent 16 months jailed in various facilities in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, where she was sometimes shackled, frequently submitted to strip searches, occasionally punished for practicing ritual ablution before a morning prayer, and once locked in a maximum security cell with an inmate convicted of felony. On August 25, 1995, thanks to the help of a cousin who found and paid an attorney, an asylum hearing was held, but the immigration judge considered her story to be inconsistent and irrational and denied her the refugee status. On May 2, 1996, with the assistance this time of a law student who presented the case to one of her professors, a new hearing took place at the Board Immigration Appeals, who granted her asylum. Actually, the decision had been somewhat prepared, if not influenced, by a series of articles in the New York Times starting on April 15 with a front page headline reading, "Woman's plea for asylum puts tribal ritual on trial." The lawyer who had initiated the litigation later founded the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies at the University of California's Hastings Center of the Law, and the so-called matter of Kasinga set a precedent in the United States immigration law for what became known as gender-based persecution. The story certainly sounds familiar to some of you. Fauzia Kasinga, that's a real name under which she later published her autobiography, Do They Hear When You Cry, was born in southern Togo in a Muslim family as a member of the ethnic group Chamba, from which she hailed. She should have undergone clitoridectomy during her adolescence, but her father, being a man with modern ideas about these issues, spared her this operation. When he died, however, her paternal aunt, a traditional and severe woman, became the primary authority figure in the family and decided to marry her to a 45-year-old, well-to-do local politician who had already 3 wives. Before the wedding, she was supposed to have the circumcision. By fear of both forced marriage and ritual cutting, the young woman fled across the border to Ghana with the help of her sister and the financial support of her mother. She purchased a plane ticket to Germany, where a woman pitied her and offered her shelter. 2 months later, she met in the street a Nigerian man to whom she told her story and who proposed her to sell her a false British passport so that she could seek asylum in the United States. She did so, and this is how she ended up at Newark International Airport. The immigration judge did not believe the story, but pressured by non-governmental organizations and national newspapers, the Board of Immigration Appeals took a contrary decision. Among the so-called credible testimonies and supporting documentary evidences was the contribution of an anthropologist, Charles Piot, professor at Duke University. Solicited as expert witness because he had conducted research in Togo, he was somewhat reluctant to testify in the case because his field work was located in a different region from that of Fauzia, where genital cutting was not practiced. Sympathetic to her situation, he nevertheless filed a letter that summarized the available ethnographic literature on the Chamba and confirmed the probability for a woman belonging to this ethnic group to undergo clitoridectomy before marriage. After the final favorable decision of the court, Charles Piot took the opportunity of being back in Togo to try to make better sense of the story, which had meanwhile taken a global turn, with US reporters conducting investigation on so-called Chamba traditions, and the US Embassy pushing the Togolese government to pass a law against what was then designated as female genital mutilation. Knowing my interest for issues about asylum, Charles Piot generously gave me his unpublished notes. Although he did not want to undermine Fauzia's narrative, he found out that the man she was supposed to marry was 28 rather than 45, and a petty trader instead of a wealthy politician, that the allegedly modern father had 4 wives in 4 different towns and had clitoridectomy practiced on his own daughters, and that according to a well-informed Togolese official, Fauzia's story was quite compatible with an international prostitution ring between her country, Germany, and the United States, of which several other cases had been documented. If caught, the women were supposed to say they were fleeing genital cutting, the official indicated. while it was unquestionable that the marriage had been arranged, that the circumcision would have had to be practiced had she stayed, Charles Piot considered Fauzilla's recount to be, quote, a story with multiple authors, including the lawyers, the journalists, and the US asylum law itself, with the effect of producing a caricature of African societies to the Western world in order to win the case. I would like to take this story as the point of departure of a reflection on asylum and refugees from the perspective of truth. Admittedly, this is a complex philosophical question. Yet, I want to explore it in the case of asylum and refugees by posing two distinct sets of questions. What is the truth of asylum, and what are the truths of the refugees? By the truth of asylum, I mean the content of the notion generally thought to be inscribed in the text of the 1951 Geneva Convention on refugees, but in fact permanently rewritten and transformed. Until the matter of Kasinga in particular, female circumcision was not regarded as a persecution. Women or girls exposed to it were not viewed as constituting a social group. Gender issues were not included in the perimeter of the Geneva Convention. The implication is that the truth of asylum is a historical construction. This constructivist understanding of truth contradicts with a spontaneous positivist view. It can be traced as far as the early 18th century with Giambattista Vico's famous formulation, verum esse ipsum factum, the truth is precisely what is made. By the truth of the refugees, I mean what is achieved through their accounts, which is habitually described in terms of the relations between what they tell and what really occurred, and between these alleged facts and the legal definition of asylum, but which are actually the result of the collaborative work of the asylum seekers, the councils, the magistrates, the reporters, sometimes the anthropologists. In the case of Fauzia, what did happen to her is unknown. The reason for her leaving the country are debatable. The authenticity and accuracy of her narrative cannot be established. And the only certainty we have is that, with the same evidence, she is first denied and then granted asylum. What counts as true is that on which a consensus is ultimately produced. This pragmatic comprehension of truth challenges the common realist view. It is expressed in the elliptic formulation of Charles Sanders Peirce in the late 19th century, truth is the end of inquiry. Far from supposing that there is a final truth, either in a text on asylum or in a narrative of those seeking it, these two theoretical frames allow us to address critically what is represented in reference to the founding text as an immutable reality, and in the investigation of the claimant's past as the search for a definitive veracity. Consequences are crucial for the social sciences as well as for political action. The analysis I will propose of the truth of asylum and the truths of the refugees is empirically grounded in research I have conducted in the last decade or so, mostly in France, but I believe the findings have a broader relevance. My investigation includes the study of a corpus of asylum seekers' files and of 300 medical and psychological certificates in support of their applications, interviews with claimants to the refugee status, lawyers, rapporteurs, magistrates, and members of non-governmental organizations involved in asylum granting, and observation of the everyday work of the National Court of Asylum in 2009 and 2010, as well as of the Conference of the European Ministers of the Interior for the establishment of the so-called Pact on Immigration and Asylum in September 2008. Moreover, at different moments, I have been involved in these issues via what one may call observant participation, as opposed to the participant observation classically claimed by ethnographers, alternately as a physician writing medical certificates, as an activist chairing the French Committee for the Exiles, and more simply as a citizen involved in public debates in France. In other words, my reflection should be viewed as inscribed as the crossroad of classical ethnography and public anthropology. Since I arrived at the Institute, my reflection on these issues has been substantially enriched by my exchanges with colleagues who study them in the United States, South Africa, Hong Kong, Australia, and Britain, thus allowing me the more global perspective I will outline tonight. During the 2012 London Olympics, Mo Farah, a Somali-born British track and field athlete, became a national hero in Britain by winning 2 gold medals for the 5,000 and 10,000 meters. Commenting on these exploits, former Somali world champion Abdi Bile responded, "We're happy for Mo, he's our pride, but we will not forget Samia." This is how the world learned of the tragic fate of his compatriot Samia Yusuf Omar, whose grace and courage had enchanted the spectators attending the 2008 Beijing Olympics 200 meters heats, in which she had finished last but more applauded than the winner. The flurry of interest that she aroused was related to the ordeal that she had faced to get there, having grown in Mogadishu in a context of war, deprivation, and prejudices against women practicing sports. After the Olympics, she returned to the internally displaced persons camp where her family lived at the moment when the Al-Shabaab banned all Somalis from participating in sports, and the popular minister of sports was killed in a suicide bombing. After a life-threatening encounter with an Islamist militant, Samia fled to the neighboring Ethiopia to continue practicing and later decided to try to reach Europe. She traveled to Sudan, crossed the Sahara, and arrived in Libya, where she was arrested and detained for several months in one of the prisons where refugees were tortured. Eventually, she was liberated and could take a boat, which broke down offshore from the Italian coast. Samia drowned with other passengers. In a press release, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees mentioned that 30 such vessels representing 1,400 people had arrived from Libya during the previous 4 months. Samia was thus one of the 18,200 persons who died at the borders of Europe in the past 20 years, most of them attempting to cross the Mediterranean Sea. For the sole year 2011, in the context of the Arab Spring and the Libyan war, more than 1,500 had drowned attempting to flee the violence and reach Europe. Ironically, France, who intervened militarily with Britain against the troops of Muammar Gaddafi in the name of humanitarianism, rejected the few hundred persons fleeing his regime and the war. Meanwhile, tens of thousands were packed in camps at the Tunisian border. So, was Samia a refugee, as UNHCR qualified the Somalis undergoing these journeys? Would she have sought asylum had she reached Europe? We will never know. We can only say that she had lived in a camp for internally displaced persons, that she had fled violence and persecutions, and that she wanted to find a refuge, if not a status of refugee, in Europe to practice her sport. The fragments of her story, which she will never recount, are, however, telling of the hardships endured by those trying to escape the violence of their home country. They also reveal the blurred boundaries of the categories of refugees and asylum in the south and their juridical hardening in the north, since Samia could be viewed as a refugee as long as she was in Africa, but in Europe, she would have had to be granted the status. As long as it remained a marginal phenomenon, asylum was conceived as a social and spatial exception, a special protection infringing the normal functioning of human relation, and a hospitality obligation revealing a deep ambivalence towards aliens. As analyzed by Hannah Arendt, the increase of the refugees and stateless people after 2 world wars transformed it into a political and legal issue involving sovereignty and rights, progressively shifting from a European problem to a global one, having increasingly to do with the control of population. This major shift from control of population from protection of persecuted individual to control of population was accompanied by profound changes in the moral and ethical contours and content of asylum. What one considers as a refugee has never ceased to evolve. Following the historian Fustel de Coulanges, it is generally assumed that the notion of asylum finds its origin both etymological and historical in the immunized space of Greek temples, from Zulon right to seizure. Priests invented the principle of asylum, refuge, to protect themselves from invaders and warriors. Translated in Latin as asylum, sanctuary, the word took on a substantially different signification, designating a safe place outside of the city where pariahs, criminals, slaves, and significantly for its contemporary interpretation, political opponents could escape justice and punishment. These sites were inviolable. Both Greek and Roman notions refer to sacredness, that is, a separation, in this case physical, from the profane world. They designate a space of exception. Beyond this literal origin, the archaeology of asylum is also grounded in another tradition, that of hospitality. Philological inquiry into this concept reveals its remarkable ambiguity in Indo-European language, as established by Émile Benveniste, since the word is derived from hospes, the guest, itself stemming from hostis, the enemy, which provides the root for hostility. Both terms thus refer to the stranger, who can be viewed under a favorable or inimical light. Considering this semantic as well as historiographical legacy, we have then 2 founding truths of contemporary asylum: the sacred right to protection in an inviolable space, independent of the refugee condition, and the ambivalence of hospitality, always in danger of hostility. The modernity of asylum, as it emerges slowly from the end of the 18th century, but on a much firmer pace since World War I, is shaped by 2 factors. One demographic, the other political. On the one hand, asylum tends to no longer refer only to individuals or groups of individuals. It encompasses thousands and sometimes millions of potential refugees, Russians fleeing the Bolshevik regime, Armenians attempting to escape Turkish massacres, Republicans pursued by the Spanish nationalists, Jews persecuted by the Nazis, and finally, immense masses of displaced persons after World War II. On the other hand, asylum is no longer the province of cities, but of states, where the logic of universal protection competes with the logic of national sovereignty. Under this new configuration, an increasingly bureaucratic control is exerted over those trying to cross borders. The distinction between immigrants and refugees starts to become problematic. The ratification of the Geneva Convention on the 28th of July 1951, preceded by the creation of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and followed by the establishment of specific bodies in charge of the regulation of asylum in most countries, provided both a legal framework and an institutional network to address the issues. The Geneva Convention, it is rarely acknowledged, is limited in scope to the victims, quote, of events occurring before the 1st of January 1951, meaning that it exclusively pertained to Europeans who were the victims of World War II. It was only in 1967 that the Protocol of New York, quote, considering that it is desirable that equal status should be enjoyed by all refugees, quote, this protocol generalized the protection to anyone corresponding to the definition of a refugee. However, it soon became obvious that the globalization of asylum, with its ambition of fair treatment for all victims, was following a profoundly asymmetrical and unequal path. To put it schematically, in the north, the asylum seekers, and in the south, the refugees. The asylum seekers are in a process of assessment of their situation, whereas the refugees are supposed to need protection without prior evaluation. And this is not a difference of vocabulary or even status. It is a difference of regime of recognition. In developing countries, where the so-called population of concern in the UNHCR lexicon reaches 13 million in Africa and 14.5 million in Asia, refugees are often enclosed in camps under the official protection of international agencies and with the assistance of non-governmental relief organizations. This limbo often lasts for decades, the camps being progressively transformed into cities where the population continues to experience vulnerability, as in Dadaab, Kenya, where with 380,000 registered individuals, the largest camp in the world. This is also the case of the Palestinian camps in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. In this context, refugees are recognized as such simply because they are assumed to be what they say they are. There is hardly any inquiry into their past to verify whether their situation satisfies the criteria of the Geneva Convention. By contrast, in the rich world, where the population of concern represents 3 million in Western Europe and 500,000 in North America, in other words, 8 times less than in the developing world, few are being granted the refugee status. They can do so through two very distinct procedures. The first one consists for individuals to seek asylum via the specific state institution of the host country. Each application for the precious status is the object of a cautious investigation and of a possible appeal, the whole process often implying a long inquisition into the person's past and speculation about his or her future. The second path, consists for the host country in resettling the refugees they choose. The UNHCR submits files of refugees carefully selected in camps to the concerned governments who determine quota. Asylum seeking is the common procedure in Western Europe, whereas resettlement represents the dominant practice in North America. The happy few who obtain the refugee status, on either way, are warranted physical security and social welfare. In summary, we have mass treatment with precarious living conditions in the South, parsimonious selection potentially leading to substantial benefits in the North. This North-South divide somewhat simplifies the picture, though, and one major exception is South Africa, which has currently, by far, the highest number of asylum seekers in the world. Over the past decades, the global distribution of refugees has considerably changed, the weight being increasingly borne by two continents, Asia and Africa, with two countries overburdened, Pakistan with 1.7 million refugees and Iran with 900,000, a generosity that is rarely evoked about these countries these days. Conversely, Europe and North America take a decreasing share, Germany and Canada being exception in that matter. Considering two countries that represent both numerically and symbolically significant host nations, it is remarkable that between 1960 and today, while the total number of refugees has multiplied by 7 worldwide, it has decreased respectively by 16% in France and 50% in the United States, whereas the global presence of refugees has become more significant, their protection has been continuously restricted in affluent societies. In a lecture he gave recently at Princeton University, the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, Alexander Aleynikov, summarized the contemporary global divide of the refugee question. Using what I see as the rhetorical figure called preterition, he first explained that a cynical interpretation, to which, of course, he did not adhere, would suggest that poor countries open their borders while rich ones open their purses. And then went on giving the figures of the budget of this organization, whose programs are funded by North American and West European countries up to 96%, and the figures of the percent of concern, of whom 90% are concentrated in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, thus confirming the so-called cynical interpretation. But beyond this quantitative transformation I have just outlined, and of course they have also profound qualitative consequences, I want to emphasize three major changes that have largely been overlooked, although they have radically redefined the refugee question in rich countries over the past decades. One concerns the dramatic decline in asylum, the other two, its reconfiguration. In the mid-1970s in France, 95% of 18,000 applicants were granted asylum by the French Office for the Refugees and Stateless People. 30 years later, the rate had plummeted to 12% out of 26,000 claimants. In 3 decades, the proportion of asylum seekers denied a status had thus declined from 1 out of 20 to almost 18 out of 20. It is often believed that this decrease is due to an increase in claims, which implies that many economic migrants would take advantage of the commitments of rich countries to human rights. In fact, there is strictly no statistical correlation between the two data, and the contraction of agreements continues even in periods of reduction of the number of applicants. But the argument of the escalation of demands has effectively fueled the suspicion toward asylum seekers, who are more and more regarded and even publicly denounced as bogus refugees. This expression was born in the context of growing restriction on demographic flux from the south and of expanding confusion between the policies of control of immigration and the politics of asylum. By disqualifying the applicants, one legitimized the stricter interpretation of the Geneva Convention. The transformation of the representation of the asylum seekers is remarkable. In the 1970s, their image was positively connoted. On the one hand, the victims of Latin American dictatorships, Chileans after 1973, Argentinians after 1976, were viewed as heroes, many being politically engaged intellectuals. On the other hand, the victims of the Southeast Asian communist regimes, mostly Cambodian and Vietnamese boat people from 1979 on, were regarded as sufferers, which led to an unprecedented humanitarian rescue undertaking. Since then, it is not so much the demography of the refugees, but their image that has changed. Whether they are Kurds from Turkey, Chechens from Russia, Afghans, Congolese, or Asians, in spite of what we know about the respect of minorities and the endemic character of violence in these countries, the claimants no longer elicit admiration or suspicion or compassion. They are simply a burden. But this discredit depends significantly on the country where applications are examined. For instance, in Europe, the rate of recognition for Afghans is as low as 11% in Greece and as high as 73% in Sweden. Whereas the value of asylum seekers generally declined in recent decades, paradoxically, a new category of legitimate refugees was created. In 2010, as 13% of asylum seekers were granted an international protection by the Office of the Refugees and Stateless People in France, the country which unexpectedly obtained the most favorable results in terms of recognition of its claimants was Mali, with a remarkable rate of 75%. At that time, its inhabitants experienced a peaceful and democratic situation, which is obviously not the case anymore today. The reason why Mali was an exception to this general restrictive interpretation of the Geneva Convention resided in the recognition in 2001 of a so-called particular social group, according to the official terminology, composed of, quote, women who fear with reason to be submitted to a genital mutilation against their will, unquote, were they, of course, to return to their country, and a protection that was later extended to parents opposing traditional circumcision for their daughter and thereby invoking for themselves the risk of persecution. The rate of recognition thus increased from 0.1% to 75% between 2001 and 2010. This was part of a global trend of which the Kasinga case, as we've seen before, in the United States is an illustration. This evolution, grounded in the protection of the body of girls and women from violation of its integrity by traditional practices, indicates a reconfiguration of the perimeter of asylum. The case of female circumcision is indeed part of a broader process of inclusion of the intimate with forced marriage, domestic violence, and homophobic abuse being increasingly invoked by applicants. The, quote, well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, unquote, which is the definition of by the Article 1 of the Geneva Convention, has actually followed a silent revolution. A deflationary trend of recognized persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, and public opinion, and an inflationary tendency of the open category of the particular social group, essentially in relation to gender-based and sexual orientation-based persecution. In my observations, whereas most accounts of ethnic, religious, or political violence were obsessively scrutinized, generating suspicion and frequently denial of the status, stories of gender torment and sexual harassment received favorable attention, aroused sympathy, rose little questioning, and ultimately often benefited from a positive assessment. The inclusion of the intimate in the recognition of claims translate, of course, a redefinition of what is considered to be political to include gender and sexual issues, and it has, of course, a much larger scope. Today, when seeking asylum, one is more legitimate claiming to be the victim of cruel treatment on the basis of gender and sexuality than of political engagement, religious belief, or ethnic belonging. Parallel to this transformation of the core of asylum, another evolution redefines its boundaries. It emphasizes more suffering than rights and appeals to compassion rather than it claims entitlement. An illustration will help clarify this transformation. On February 17, 2001, a Cambodia-registered cargo ship ran aground on the French Riviera. The 900 men, women, and children from the Middle East who were on board explained to the French authorities that they were Kurds fleeing the Iraqi regime and that they intended to seek asylum in Germany or Britain. The first reaction of the socialist government of the time was to deny them access to the French territory, considering them to be undocumented immigrants. The survivors of the shipwreck were imprisoned in an improvised camp. However, broadcasted images of crying children, desperate women, and the crippled elderly behind the barbed wire shocked many, and under the pressure of public opinion, the Prime Minister reversed course, declaring, quote, that priority should be given to the humanitarian route, unquote. The survivors received a safe conduct, but in fact, the great majority of them did what they had announced and pursued their journey to the neighboring countries. However, from the inquiry into their applications, it appeared that they were not Iraqis, but Syrians, and not Kurds, but Yazidis, another minority. They had been informed by smugglers that their chance of being granted asylum would be much higher if they declared that they came from Iraq than from Syria, and one can guess that the reverse would be true today. This anecdote is revealing of the moral geography of tyranny as it is constructed in the contemporary world and translated into local imaginaries. One can certainly appreciate that a more humane solution was proposed in that case than that of the Australian government, who 6 months later refused permission to a distressed vessel with 438 Afghans to enter national waters. Yet, the crucial point I want to make is that whereas the Geneva Convention should have sufficed to deal with the cases, humanitarian principles and moral sentiments were invoked instead. What was a question of rights became an object of pity. In fact, one could argue that the politics of resettlement itself, much favored by the UNHCR, and for good reasons, which are to provide durable solutions for people who have no perspective of going back to their country, also relies on a form of charitable gesture. It concerns less than 1% of the refugees living in poor countries. States who practice resettlement determine their ceiling and choose among candidates previously selected by the UNHCR those they will admit. So not only do governments as well as the international agency discriminate among refugees, but the entire process privileges the sole benevolence of the host country. The United States, which is the country most involved in this program worldwide with around 80,000 refugees resettled each year, is also the country that tends to imprison asylum seekers before their possible appearance before the immigration judge. The measured generosity of the sovereign prevails over the respect of the rights of the claimant. In other words, national consideration over international laws. Now that we have a picture of the changing landscape of asylum, we can move to the analysis of the arduous path of refugees. On August 23, 2011, in the case of New York versus Strauss-Kahn, all charges of sexual assault and attempted rape against the former head of the International Monetary Fund were dismissed by the court as requested by the prosecutor. 3 months later, the French politician, 3 months earlier, the French politician had been accused of abuse by an employee of the Sofitel hotel chain and arrested on the grounds of 4 felony crimes plus 3 misdemeanor offenses. The 32-year-old housekeeper, Nafissatou Diallo, was a refugee from Guinea who had sought and been granted asylum in the United States. When asked by New York prosecutors if she had been the victim of other assaults in the past, she told them on 2 occasions that she had been gang raped by soldiers in her home country, giving vivid details about the scene, exhibiting great emotion in recounting the events, and showing scars on her body that were the consequence of the violence to which she had been submitted. After having changed civil lawyer, she was advised to be honest with the prosecution, and in subsequent interviews, she forswore, admitting that she had fabricated this story, but explaining that after having provided it in her asylum application, she had kept up the deceit. Yet, when they examined her written statement to obtain the refugee status, the prosecutors found no trace of what the young woman declared she had told the administration. Actually, it appeared that at the time she was filing her asylum application, she consulted a man who gave her a tape recording including the account of a rape that she was directed to memorize and repeat, but she had finally renounced using it, which she had forgotten. This lie discredited Nafissatou Diallo and made her accusation untenable. Remarkably, 3 weeks before the decision, The New Yorker published a story entitled The Asylum Seeker with the following heading: "For chance of a better life, it helps to make your bad story worse." It concerned a young African woman, Caroline, from whom the author had interviewed and followed in the course of her asylum application process, thus discovering that she had forged a narrative of beating and rape by government soldiers in her country. Caroline explained that she had been tutored by her landlady in the Bronx as to how to act as a rape victim, which included attending group therapy sessions, getting prescriptions from a psychiatrist, and obtaining a certificate from a gynecologist. However, she confirmed that, as she had declared, her parents were truly political opponents, and she had been effectively harassed by the army, feeling threatened because of her family's past. The author of this article was neither cynical nor moralistic about the fabrication of the young woman's story. Considering that individuals in situations like Caroline had no choice but to enhance the tragic dimension of their personal narrative, she wrote, "Atrocity stories get inflated as applicants compete with the lore of other applicants." Certainly, the reader could not avoid a parallel with the Sofitel affair, with the same blurring of lines between truth and lies, pure invention and mere exaggeration, legitimate justification to fabric facts, and bad reason to exploit public administration. The conjunction of the two stories was part, in fact, of a larger picture worldwide, which suggests the commonality of deception in asylum claims and elicits diffuse mistrust towards refugees. When the refugee question seemed on the verge of being resolved, that is, in the 1960s or 1970s, the word of applicants telling the story of their persecution to the officers in charge of granting asylum generally sufficed. The generosity that prevailed in those years was, in fact, largely a consequence of economic needs for the reconstruction of Europe and the growth of North America. A convergence existed at that time between the moral ideals of the Geneva Convention and the material interests of the Western world. This period lasted a quarter of a century until immigration started to be viewed as a problem rather than an opportunity for industrialized societies. Although asylum was supposed to continue to be treated separately, the two issues became increasingly conflated in national and later European policies. The practical consequence of this new situation has been that the sophistication of the process of inquiry into each application for asylum and the fabrication of a system that could combine efficacy in terms of triage and fairness for the decisions. In France, as in most Western countries, the bureaucracy of asylum comprises two levels and two institutions. A first step in the procedure is administrative. In the French Office for the Protection of Refugees and Stateless People, on the basis of an examination of the application, usually complemented by an interview of the applicant, officers decide whether asylum should be granted. The second step is juridical, consisting in an appeal to the National Court of Asylum. During the public hearing, the rapporteur makes recommendations, then the lawyer pleads, and the three magistrates question the claimant. Eventually, a secret deliberation is held, and the adjudication is announced a few weeks later. One could view these two moments, administrative and juridical, as two trials. And this is, in fact, the way claimants experience them. Officers and judges have to make a difficult decision under these circumstances concerning the validity of the claims in a context where public discourses stigmatize asylum seekers, suggesting that most of them are economic migrants exploiting the system. They cannot seem too generous, but they must be fair. Using the language and form of justice leads to two observations. First, in philosophical terms, these institutions function as the symmetrical of retributive justice. It is not a suspect who is judged, but an alleged victim. The outcome is not punishment, but recognition. However, by a troubling moral shift, contrary to regular tribunals where the accused is presumed innocent until proven guilty, the claimant is usually treated as suspicious before proven sincere. In other words, the alleged victim becomes a suspect. The entire investigation, as well as the public hearing, is oriented toward the search for errors and contradiction, which could reveal the bad faith of the applicant. This systematic suspicion regarding the asylum seekers transforms the inquiry on truth-telling into a process of lie detecting, which can sometimes turn into an exercise of public cruelty, as I often witnessed. And second, in sociological terms, these institutions adopt the principles of what is generally characterized as tragic choice, that is, the allocation of a rare but vital resource to people who need it. The classical illustration in sociology is organ donation, for which there are less potential donors than possible recipients. In the case of asylum, the resource is rare not because of quota, but because of the symbolic value attached to it, and the choice is tragic because decisions made by officers and magistrates involve the lives of asylum seekers, both in terms of social welfare, if they are granted the refugee status, and in terms of deadly risk, if they are denied and deported. The truth that officers, rapporteurs, and magistrates seek is apparently easy to describe. It comprises two parts. Can the account of the applicant be regarded as true? And if so, does it conform to the criteria previously defined as the truth of asylum? This exploration may be described in the terms of the correspondent theory of truth, as formulated by Bertrand Russell, for instance, according to which truth is a relation between proposition and the world, such as the world contains facts structurally similar to the proposition. More simply, this means two things. The first question posed to the applicant is, are you telling us the truth about what happened to you, the persecution you endured, and about what could happen were you to return to your country, that is the risk of persecution? And the second question is, if we accept that you are telling us the truth, does the reality you describe satisfies the definition of the Geneva Convention, that is the well-founded fear of persecutions? Both questions are, however, highly problematic, the first one being even impossible to answer beyond the shadow of a doubt, while the second one is always a matter of interpretation. In the courts, for instance, rapporteurs search for evidence of the persecution by comparing information produced by the claimants and events recorded by the press or non-governmental organization, by confronting their account with the expert knowledge collected by political scientists and legal specialists of the institution, and even, although exceptionally in France, by anthropologists. Judges cross-examine the applicants on their engagement as activists or on the violence endured, and ask for details about political parties, religious groups, national leaders, street demonstrations, juridical procedures, and topographies of prisons or camps, testing the consistency of the narrative. On the other side, counselors assist applicants in the making of their story, and some non-governmental organizations have developed activities of so-called assistance to narrative, not to invent facts, but rather to prepare their clients to the expectations of the judges. Beyond their account, whose accuracy and reliability are always questioned, applicants produce documents such as an organization chart of a political party, the sentencing of a trial, the testimony of an activist, a newspaper article, and increasingly medical and psychological certificates attesting to the existence of scars or trauma. Yet, this data can also be called into question. Is it not forged? And even if it's authentic, what proof does it provide? As a judge commented to a Bangladeshi applicant belonging to a minority who had previously asserted that several of his close relatives had been murdered, and provided a picture of himself lying seriously wounded on a hospital bed, there was no proof that this injury was related to a beating, as the claimant affirmed. He could have simply fallen from his bicycle, the magistrate coldly commented. In the end, establishing the correspondence between what is being told and what has happened or could still occur supposes a certain degree of adhesion to the narrative. In the deliberations I attended, the last word was rarely that facts were undoubtedly established. Most of the time, the decision relied on the so-called personal conviction. She looked sincere when she told her story, would say the judges. Thus, to understand how magistrates arrive at this sense of conviction, the existence of discursive and material elements are not sufficient. Considering an account to be true is more than a question of veracity. It is a question of sincerity. The truth judges seek does not so much concern the correspondence between propositions and facts, stories and realities, as it assesses the coherence between the narrative and the person. In its strict original form, the coherence theory of truth, such as characterized, among others, by Harold Joachim, refers to a vision in which truth, in singular, characterizes a significant whole, and therefore that a belief is true as part of a current system of beliefs rather than because its relation to facts. This model can be expanded to subjectivities. In the case of asylum seekers, the significant whole is more than the narrative and the documents related to it. It includes the person and her authenticity. Is the individual soliciting asylum the victim she says she is? In this context, the presentation of the self and the moment of hearing can be critical. The 20 to 40 minutes that the public examination of the case lasts in the national court become a performance in which veracity is put to the test of sincerity. Officers and magistrates expect the applicant to embody the affliction she had endured. This is not to say that applicants are playing a role. Actually, one could even state that the less they seem to be acting, the better. But from my observation during the hearings and my interviews with judges, it appears that certain cases were decided as the result of the impression of deception or candor made by the claimants on the judges. The way they dress, held their head, expressed their feeling when telling the most tragic moments of their story, seemed firm on their assertion rather than hesitant or confused. Every element of the performance could be interpreted as authenticating or discrediting the account. A modest exhibition of suffering through tears would often arouse compassion, whereas a display of dignity elicited admiration. More generally, attitudes were the object of definitive interpretation that the judge declares to establish, sometimes on the basis of their colonial past, exotic readings, touristic experience, rather than perhaps anthropological knowledge. Looking down when answering the questions of the judges could be regarded as a lack of genuineness by some, while others would relate this attitude to cultural differences, especially if it were a woman. But class affinities were important for certain magistrates, would project more easily their affects towards someone resembling them, whereas others would seem more touched by applicants situated at their opposite in the social scale. For want of unquestionable factual evidence provided by the claimants, the judges assess who they are rather than what they tell. Yet, to what extent do correspondence and coherence theories of truth account for the truth of the refugees? If one adds, so to speak, narratives and documents on the one hand and personalities and attitudes on the other, if one combines veracity and sincerity, as I have done, what impact can one observe on the final decision of the judges? The answer to this question is somewhat disappointing, especially when one considers the spectacular variations in adjudication of cases. A remarkable study undertaken by the research group TRACK at Syracuse University, based on almost 300,000 reviewed cases over 10 years, indicate that the asylum denial among the 208 US immigration judges who made at least 100 decisions for statistical reasons varies from 96.7% to 9.8%. In other words, depending on which magistrate examined the cases, an asylum seeker has between 3% and 90% to be recognized. These disparities are not due to the location of the court. 2 are in New York and 2 in Miami among the 5 most severe judges, and 3 are from New York and 1 from Miami among the 5 more lenient. And they are not related either to the nationality of the claimants. The denial rates vary from 7 to 95% for the Chinese, from 16 to 99% for the Asians, and from 2 to 96% for Colombians. Of course, everyone knows that justice decisions vary from one judge to another in any court. But it is unlikely that unfairness reaches anywhere such levels. In France, similarly, disparities existed among the 160 judges of the National Court, and the General Secretary explained to me what a problem it was. The discrepancies seemed not as high as what I mentioned for the United States, but it is difficult to say since the system was also less transparent about individual decisions. One spoke of a range between 5% and 70% of recognition rates. Such findings therefore suggest a third interpretation of the truth of the refugees based on the pragmatic theory developed by William James and John Dewey after Pierce. Against realist theories, these authors consider that there is no absolute truth, but that truth is simply the end of inquiry. Is it not ultimately what makes the truth of the refugees? I don't want to appear relativistic in proposing this conclusion. I'm simply attempting to account for what society considers being true. Since one knows that persecutions of certain groups or individuals do exist in the world, and this is what justified the Geneva Convention. But since it is almost impossible to ascertain without the shadow of a doubt the veracity of the account and the sincerity of the claimant, the deliberations I attended were extremely clear in that regard, one is left with what mathematicians might call an undecidable problem, except if one admits that truth is what institutions decide to be true. We do not have access to the ultimate truth of what really happened to the asylum seekers or how honest their recollection has been. But we do have access to what officers and judges think is true. Indeed, each time I would ask a rapporteur or magistrate after a 5 or 6 hours hearing, during which only 1 or 2 applicants out of 10 or 12 were granted the refugee status, what they thought of the decision that had been taken. These individuals, deeply committed to their mission of defense of the right of asylum, almost always replied that they had the conviction that the claimants had been treated fairly and no injustice had been committed. Their certainty sharply contrasted with my own wavering. To conclude, asylum is one of the oldest social institutions. As institutionalist theories of sociologists, economists, and political scientists have shown, what characterizes institutions is their stability as much as their ability to change, which is in fact the condition for their permanence. What I've shown here is that asylum, far from being this definitive truth inscribed in the 1951 Geneva Convention, to which everyone refers, is constantly interpreted and transformed. During the past 3 decades in particular, the number of refugees has increased worldwide, whereas the proportion of claimants being granted asylum has diminished drastically, leading to a disequilibrium between masses of refugees in the south and queues of asylum seekers in the north. But the content and contours of what we consider asylum to be also evolved, opening new avenues for intimate violence and revealing a humanitarian turn. These mutations reflect and contribute to our understanding of what is political and what is a right. The truth of asylum is therefore a truth about our world. But moving closer to the process of granting asylum to applicants, I have also demonstrated that although it is based on the truth of their stories acknowledged by officers and magistrates through their narratives and documents, the veracity of the account and the sincerity of the person could not be sufficient considering in particular the doubts that persisted and mainly the disparities that existed in the decisions. The only definitive truth of the refugee could not be absolute, but should be regarded as the final result of the investigation on which a consensus emerged among the judges. The truth of the refugee was the end of their inquiry. Yet, a tension remains to be discussed between the truth of asylum and the truth of the refugees. How can magistrates resolve the contradiction between the spirit of the Geneva Convention, which profoundly animates most of them, and the adjudication that they make, restraining the refugee status to a small minority of applicants? Here is a remarkable paradox which took me some time to comprehend. Actually, the more restrictive individual decisions are, the more consideration they demonstrate towards the principle of the Convention. Thus, it becomes possible to articulate the truth of asylum as a valued and scarce good, and the truth of the asylum seekers as subjected to mistrust and inquisition. This paradox presents some flaws, though. In 2003, the French Office for the Protection of the Refugees and Stateless People denied asylum to a 26-year-old Sri Lankan Tamil man. He had told the asylum officer that he lived in a zone under the control of the LTTE rebels, that his brother had been killed by the soldiers loyal to the government, that along with his father, he himself had been arrested, imprisoned, and tortured by the National Army, and that following his release, he had been suspected by the Tamil Tigers of colluding with the enemy. The officer considered his story to be too stereotypical and not enough substantiated. The appeal was rejected in 2004. He resubmitted his application, which was again refused in 2005. The young man was deported to Sri Lanka. 18 months later, the news came that he had been assassinated by a patrol of the National Army. In his last appeal, he had written, "I don't know what more I can do to make people believe me." His death was the ultimate evidence that he was telling the truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Didier, for this very thoughtful presentation.